Well, we live in a rapidly urbanizing world. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and we are moving rapidly to perhaps 70% in just a couple of decades. And of course, this will represent a lot of challenges, but there's also very well known that there are opportunities with this rapid urbanization as well when it comes to how we manage biodiversity and ecosystem services. So in Nagoya 2 years ago, the parties of the CBD requested a report and an assessment on the links between urbanization, biodiversity and ecosystem services. And now we're here 2 years later to hand over that assessment to the Executive Secretary of the CBD.
And what do we mean by biodiversity in cities? Are we talking about parks? Are we talking about trees? Are we talking about foxes? Give us an idea of the actual things that you'll be mentioning.
Well, this is a broad assessment, so it's not an assessment of biodiversity in cities per se. We are looking at the process of urbanization. And this is multidimensional, occurring all over the world, creating distant effects far from the cities where people are moving into. So we are looking at all these multidimensional effects and the ecological footprints of cities and how consumption patterns actually would affect biodiversity and ecosystem services. Just to give you one example, that the urban expansion in the next couple of decades will consume land approximately the size of South Africa. And this will be primarily on prime agricultural land. And of course this will have knock-on effects, because at the same time, with an increasing population and increased food demand, we need to increase food production. And when urban areas expand on agricultural land, we need to take other lands for agriculture production. And so this is, of course, a great concern for CBD. What would actually the long-term effects be?
And what are your findings? I mean, that's an incredible figure when you mentioned the size of South Africa. What are the sort of key findings from your report so far?
Well, the key findings is that if we manage to make this urbanization sustainable, there are so many things we could win in the process for human well-being and for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So in the report we outline all these many ways where cities and citizens could engage in greening the cities. And just take an example that in 2030, if we look at the total urban area, we estimate that 60% of that area has yet to be built. So just imagine what you could actually do with that area when it comes to integrate ecosystems into the architecture, greening, using ecosystems as part of your urban development to cool the city instead of building huge air conditioning systems.
Can you give us say 3 examples of how this could be achieved?
Well, this could be achieved. I mean, cities facing enormous challenges. Climate change is one, and we know that climate change will increase the frequency of heat waves. It will also cause a much higher variation in precipitation with the risk of flooding. And here is tremendous opportunity for cities to embrace what we know about ecosystems and how they could actually function as a very important component to reduce vulnerability. So for example, you could use vegetation and trees to cool the city, and then you don't need to invest in energy in systems that will demand a lot of energy for cooling. And you could use vegetation and ecosystems to reduce the risk of flooding, for example. And these are much cheaper solutions than the highly costly engineering solutions that often have been looked at.
What are we talking about in terms of costings? How much cheaper could they be?
Oh, a fraction of the cost. But you also need to have people engaged in understanding that these ecosystems need to be managed, and so we don't degrade them and we lose the functions. So it's also about the huge educational challenge. But I think in the future we will see cities of very different type than we have today. Just because the cities need to reduce the vulnerability they are facing, and they need to address food and water security. And the only way, the realistic way they could do that is by using nature-based solutions. And one of them is actually to embrace biodiversity and using ecosystem as an integrated part of urban development.
And sort of, I guess, on a final point, what city would you pick, or what urban area or country would you pick out at the moment as kind of leading in this way? Can you give us an example of a city and perhaps sort of explain why that is a particular, one we could pick and one we could follow?
I could pick maybe 50 examples around the world. But we have in the CBO between 40 and 50 examples of fantastic action on the ground. But you have, for example, Curitiba in Brazil that made a fantastic investment in using the green infrastructure as part of the urban development. And I think for a city in the global south, they actually provide a role model for how other cities could develop. And it's important to have those in tropical countries and in the global south, because that's where we will have the most intensive, rapid urbanization in the future.